Welcome back to the College of Glycation, where we explore the molecular underpinning of chronic disease, human health, and metabolic dysfunction. And we do so through the lens of glycation. I'm Paul Reynolds, a biomedical scientist and professor of cell biology, and I'm also your host. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most overlooked but profoundly important intersections in health science, and that is glycation and sleep. This episode is called Glycation and Sleep, the Forgotten Connection. And it's not hyperbole to say that this connection is both critical and neglected. Now, if you've been following along in this series, you already know the basics of glycation, but let's briefly revisit those concepts for context. Glycation is a non-enzymatic reaction in which sugars, particularly glucose and fructose, bind to proteins, lipids, and even your nucleic acids. These reactions form unstable intermediates that quickly rearrange into what we call advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. These AGEs accumulate over time and lead to stiffness, dysfunction, and notable inflammation in tissues throughout the body. They're like molecular rust, which we've talked about before, that builds up slowly but also relentlessly. And unlike enzymatic reactions that the body can control, glycation is largely uncontrolled, especially in hyperglycemic environments. So, what does this have to do with sleep, you might be wondering? Well, sleep, as you know, is one of the most restorative, dynamic physiological states our body enters into. It's anything but passive. Every night, our brains cycle through different stages of sleep. Non-REM stages 1 through 3, followed by REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. Stage 3, sometimes called slow wave sleep, is where sleep restoration actually happens the best. This is when the brain clears out metabolic waste via the glymphatic system, a brain-specific analog to the lymphatic system. And it's also a time when the body repairs tissue, consolidates memory, and recalibrates hormonal systems. REM sleep, on the other hand, is tied to emotional regulation and learning. But here's the catch. Glycation doesn't take a break during sleep. In fact, it might be actually sabotaging it. So let's explore how. First, we have to acknowledge that sleep and metabolism are deeply intertwined. Poor sleep increases insulin resistance. Just one night of sleep deprivation has been shown to reduce insulin sensitivity by 20 to 25%, a full quarter. That's not trivial. A study recently published in the journal Lancet demonstrated that even partial sleep restriction impaired glucose tolerance and elevated evening cortisol levels. Both of those are hallmarks of metabolic dysfunction. Now here is where it gets interesting. Hyperglycemia, the elevated blood sugar we see in cases of insulin resistance, is the most notable driver of glycation. So a vicious cycle begins, which you're picking up on here. Poor sleep worsens insulin sensitivity, which increases our blood sugar, which then increases glycation. Glycation, in turn, damages tissues that regulate sleep. It's a feedback loop, and again, biochemical sabotage. Let's consider melatonin. That's a hormone produced by the pineal gland that regulates sleep-wake cycles. Studies have shown that AGEs accumulate in the pineal gland, reducing melatonin synthesis in the process. This is particularly problematic in older adults, where both glycation and sleep fragmentation are very common. One study just about 5 years ago in the journal Neuroscience Letters found that AGEs impair the expression of alkylamine N acetyltransferase. That's AANAT. That is a rate-limiting enzyme in the synthesis of melatonin. If you damage AANAT, you compromise your ability to elaborate melatonin. When melatonin production therefore declines, circadian rhythms will lose their robustness. But it doesn't stop there. Glycation also targets the brainstem and the hypothalamus, areas that are responsible for generating quality sleep patterns. Animal studies have shown that glycation can impair orexin signaling. That's Orexin, orexin signaling, which plays a key role in wakefulness. Dysfunction in this case is associated with disorders like narcolepsy. In fact, research published just about 15 years ago in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, or JCI, found that mice lacking orexin exhibited narcolepsy-like symptoms, quite notably. Now imagine the added insult of glycation-induced inflammation on this fragile system, right? If you have orexin, which is key in regulating your wakefulness, sprinkle in the inflammation that happens downstream of glycation, and this fragile system is definitely in the crosshairs. Sleep disorders themselves are also exacerbated or worsened by glycation. Take obstructive sleep apnea, for example. That's a condition marked by intermittent breathing cessation during sleep. These individuals stop breathing for periods of time while sleeping. The chronic hypoxia and the oxidative stress that accumulate from sleep apnea will upregulate glycation pathways, making this vicious loop once again worsened in the process. And in return, ages are known to stiffen soft tissues in the upper airway, making apnea episodes more frequent. The anatomy is less resilient when glycation spikes, worsening your sleep apnea problem. Now, it's a two-way street, of course. There was a study published in the journal Chess by researchers led by Dr. Christouli in 2005, and the team observed elevated serum age levels. Another way to say that would be increased glycation products in the blood in patients with moderate to severe sleep apnea. And they found that that correlated with airway collapsibility, the steady closure of the airway during apnea conditions. Insomnia is the most common sleep disorder. Many among us struggle with this type of disorder. It is also linked to systemic inflammation and cortisol dysregulation, both of which are driven by, yes, you've named it, glycation. Elevated ages or glycation products activate RAGE, which is the receptor for ages, or advanced glycation end products, which is then expressed on immune and neural cells. If you activate the RAGE pathway on these cells, RAGE initiates a pro-inflammatory cascade. This cascade often involves NF-kappa B, a key regulator in inflammatory responses. Downstream of NF-kappa B, which again is a regulator of the response, you'll actually have more abundant release of cytokines. Those are the pro-inflammatory molecules that perpetuate an inflammatory reaction. Such cytokines that are upregulated in this case include IL-6 and TNF-α. These inflammatory signals interfere with sleep architecture, especially slow-wave sleep, further diminishing your sleep quality and recovery. But let's not overlook restless leg syndrome. Many have heard of this. A lesser known but incredibly frustrating condition is RLS, or restless leg syndrome. and it's associated with both peripheral nerve dysfunction as well as iron dysregulation. Ages damage the microvasculature, the small blood vessels, and the peripheral nerves in these areas, leading to exactly the kinds of neuropathic symptoms that fuel restless leg syndrome. In 2013, a study published in the journal Sleep Medicine Reviews by Dr. Early and others suggested that endothelial dysfunction, those are the cells that line the small blood vessels, as well as oxidative stress, both play a role in restless leg syndrome pathophysiology. Two processes, once again, endothelial dysfunction and oxidative stress, which are deeply implicated in the progression of glycation. So, what can we do? Well, as always, let's come back to the levers that you can actually control, those things that you can influence. Diet will play a foundational role. Diets that are high in refined sugars and processed foods are not only highly glycemic, but they're also causing glycation. Foods that are cooked at extremely high and low humidity temperatures, imagine over grilling meats, fried items, and baked goods, will also contain large amounts of preformed ages known as exogenous ages that we covered in the most recent episode in this podcast. If you reduce the consumption of these types of foods, such has been shown to lower circulating age levels. Let me highlight a study that reinforces that. In 2010, there was a study in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism that found that if you reduce dietary ages or exogenous ages, you can improve insulin sensitivity and reduce markers of inflammation, especially in patients that have metabolic syndrome. Exercise is another powerful tool. Physical activity increases insulin sensitivity, or your body's ability to respond to the signal insulin, thereby reducing blood glucose. And if you are more sensitive to insulin, you'll lower your systemic inflammation because all of that extra glucose is now unavailable for glycation. But here's the subtle nuance. Exercise can also improve your sleep quality. A study in sleep medicine published by Klein et al. In 2011 found that aerobic exercise significantly improved sleep quality in patients that have been diagnosed with chronic insomnia. And by lowering blood sugar and inflammation, exercise can also indirectly reduce the burden of glycation. Stress management and sleep hygiene also deserve notable attention. Chronic stress will elevate cortisol. That's a glucocorticoid hormone that impairs insulin sensitivity and promotes glycation. Mindfulness practices, cognitive behavioral therapy, and even simple breathwork exercises have been shown to lower cortisol levels. When you breathe through your nose and not your mouth, you activate more of a parasympathetic response. And what that means is it calms you down, lowering your cortisol levels. Breathing through your mouth without interruption all the time throughout the day more likely triggers the sympathetic reaction in the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic is what you employ when you're fighting or fleeing, and that definitely involves increasing stress levels because you are fighting or fleeing. So this type of breathwork exercises have been shown to lower your chronic stress levels, notably cortisol, and therefore improve your sleep. If you practice good sleep hygiene, that's maintaining a consistent sleep schedule, minimizing screen exposure before bed, and sleeping in a cool, dark environment, all of these hygienic aspects can help anchor your circadian rhythms and support appropriate melatonin production. Do this alone, sleep hygiene, but also partake in processed snacks for every meal would counteract these benefits. So let's try to focus on both. Now, let's not forget about, as we're talking about circadian rhythm maintenance and melatonin production made possible by a consistent sleep schedule, screen exposure minimizing, etc., let's also not forget about circadian rhythm disorders themselves, such as delayed sleep phase syndrome or shift work disorder. These are conditions where internal clocks are misaligned with the external environment. Some of these cannot be avoided, but glycation can amplify these issues, meaning ages can impair your clock gene expression and disrupt feedback loops in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, that's a part of the brain's central circadian pacemaker. So while you may be unable to avoid work schedules that counteract the normal external clock, if you will, maintenance of a good diet with exercise will help. There was a recent study in the Frontiers of Endocrinology just 4 years ago that demonstrated that age exposure altered the expression of clock, CLOCK, and BML1. Those are two genes that are expressed by neuronal cells. And that, once again, is worsened, the expression of those genes worsened by glycation. In closing, let me just mention that the connection between glycation and sleep is both intimate and, I think, underappreciated. Glycation is not just a slow burner in diabetes and aging, it's also a saboteur of the very systems that allow us to rest, recover, and regenerate. If we want to improve sleep, and by extension, metabolic, immune, and cognitive health, we need to pay attention to glycation. The good news is we have tools. Nutrition, exercise, sleep management, and proper hygiene were all discussed today as the tools in your tool belt leading you toward better sleep quality. And the science is clear. These interventions don't just help you sleep better, they also lower glycation, breaking vicious cycles that are pro-inflammatory and rampant, and therefore they help preserve the integrity of your body's most essential rhythms. Thank you very much for joining me today in this episode of the College of Glycation. When we understand how glycation damages tissues, we can take steps to interrupt that process and regain our health. As always, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay metabolically healthy.